Hi, here is part 2 of episode 0. Why am I doing this?
ARGH, not another podcast about book publishing, hosted by William May, in which the author finds himself embroiled in a podcast about book publishing.
So that must have been really frustrating for you. Here you could speak, but you couldn't necessarily read. But can you give me an example, like if you can remember, if you can't, that's cool. The word education. How are you able to understand the word education?
Well, I think that for me, the first step is I had to be able to recognize letters.
Got it.
And as a person who's dyslexic, one of my issues is to do with processing visual information. So it's very easy for me to get disoriented when I'm looking at something. So it took a long time for me to be able to say, okay, I know what letter that is, because it's very easy. Like an E and a 3 are the same things. You know, a D and a B and a P all are the same exact shape.
Oh, wow. So it's the shape of things as well.
Right. So the D, the B, the P, right? They're all the same shape. They're just different orientations. So a D is a backwards B, and a P is an upside down
B.
So if you're dyslexic and you have difficulty with that kind of orientation, I still have difficulty remembering right and left. Imagine that I gave you a thing where there were like 30 different shapes, right? And each of those shapes represented something, and you were handed a line of those shapes. And you don't know what these shapes are, but you're just, so like for me, that's what letters were. They were just these random shapes. And some of them looked identical because they are identical. It's just they have to be turned in order to be, like each one has an identity based not just on its shape, but on its placement. And so as someone who's dyslexic, that placement issue becomes difficult.
I get it. But actually, I had no idea what it really meant until just now.
Well, so that's part of it. There's a lot of other issues that exist within dyslexia. It's not like it's just one thing,
sure.
but for me, that's a big part of it.
It's sort of what the eye see and then how the brain relates it.
It's very hard to sort of put it in terms because I don't have an experience of what it's like not to be dyslexic.
Right.
So, you're asking me like, what is your experience? And I'm like, well, you tell me yours first, because then I'll know. I'll have something to compare it to. You know what I mean?
Yeah. A P is a P. That's interesting. I guess we don't realize sometimes how lucky we are with things that we don't have.
There are a few seconds where Denise is trying to get the word. She's like, wait a minute, wait a second. So I think I'm going to cut that. So I'm going to let her just ask the question. She's asking about an example of your experience of the word education. So, and then you start talking about, processing visual information. Words have different identities. I really like that. Like overall, I really like this part.
Yeah, no, I think it's good. I think my only concerns are that I do think it's important that, to be clear that this is not like the only thing that is dyslexia. You know what I mean? That there's other issues, but I think I try to say that.
You did.
And I never say, oh, well, this is what dyslexia is. It's a broad topic. I had an educational specialist who I worked with a number of years ago who used to say to me that there's really not one dyslexia. There's a variety of things that you could call the dyslexias. Yeah. So I don't want to pigeonhole it as something, in that way.
Moving to the next section.
And I was thinking when you were first talking about being in school and you were talking about the teachers just wanted to pass you on and let it be someone else's problem. That's not happening to us. It's not our issue. Pass it on. But what I was thinking is teaching itself and the idea of education I always had issues personally with being in a class with all these people and everybody talking about like one person speaking to all these different people about something. And I never loved the classroom because of that, because I felt like I don't want to be spoken to like one of 500 or one of 30. I want to be spoken to I like one-on-one. And so what I think neurodiversity has brought into play as well for young people, for children, for kids, is the idea of being an individual. So like everybody has a way to learn, everybody has a way not to learn, And so the world had to embrace, as we got bigger, as the world became bigger and teachers, more classrooms, more teachers, we had to all like kind of slow down and say, hey, not everybody learns the same way. People do have issues. You can't just cover it up anymore.
Anytime you're addressing issues that we would label under ableism in general, you're really talking about the ability to make things accessible. And
right.
That's always about individuality. That's always about a person's individual needs. So, I mean, I do think that there's a way in which this conversation that we're talking about is largely about how do we embrace everyone as an individual and who they are. And I just this weekend, I was telling you, I was making a big meal for a number of members of my family. And my mother has a rice allergy. Can't have any rice, which not a big deal generally, except that one of my cousin's daughters is gluten-free because she has celiac. So I have to balance these needs, because I don't want a meal where, some people can eat this and some people can eat that. I want everyone to feel welcome at my table.
Right.
I want everyone to feel like a member of the family who has been cared for. For me, that's accessibility. For me, it's making a space where everyone is embraced as an individual and welcome. And, that I think is something that, like, as a cultural value, is something that we've not necessarily always been open to. I mean, I think that there are a lot of ways in which, especially in education, we've been very focused on how do we make things that are standard? How do we make there's a product. It's like, even with the idea of standardized testing, well, there it is, standardized. So the thing is that, like, in some ways, like other forms of diversity, neurodiversity and other forms of disability are something that force us to confront individuality in the way you're talking about.
And that's fine when you were talking, like, the individual. And I think, as far as your meal, what replaced the rice? What was the rice replacement?
Well, I mean, first of all, I just didn't make rice. I made free flatbread that I made using a rice-free, gluten-free flour. I made potatoes.
I was going to say, potatoes.
I mean, we were careful about what we used and what we didn't use, and recipes that didn't, the biggest issue was that, as I said, because one person is gluten-free, sometimes trying to do substitutions, and it's very easy for those substitutions to involve rice.
But here's a question for you. So you could have had rice and potatoes and said to the person who doesn't eat rice, there's potatoes, and someone who doesn't, but you wanted to make sure that everything on the table was edible by everybody.
Right. I want everyone to feel included. It's a family dinner. I want everyone to feel like they are equal, and that's, that's a personal ethic. And I do think that to some extent that comes from my experience as someone who has been othered. You were talking about, why do I talk about myself as a neurodiverse language wizard? Well, for one thing, I think neurodiverse is something that, I still very much define myself by my learning disabilities and my dyslexia. When I was a little kid and I first learned that I was dyslexic, it became something very, very important to me in a way that, like, in some ways made other people uncomfortable, because I would introduce myself as dyslexic. I would say, I'm William May and I am dyslexic.
Oh, and, that's what made you, where'd that come from?
I mean, I was a little kid. Well, I'll tell you, as I said, I couldn't learn when I was in first grade. And At a certain point, my parents, my mother especially, I'm very grateful to my mother for this. She recognized, she has a background herself in early childhood education. And she recognized her own dyslexia when she was older. And at a certain point, she decided I was dyslexic. She realized there were things that happened. I mean, she tells stories. For example, there was a story about how one day I was doing homework at the table, but the area of the table where I normally sat was covered with things. She was working on something. So she was like, you have to sit on the other side of the table. No problem. I sit on the other side of the table. I'm doing my homework. Only instead of holding my pen in my right hand, I'm holding my pen in my left hand.
Oh, wow.
And she's like, Will, how do you know what hand to hold your pen in? And I'm like, oh, it's very, very easy. Whatever hand is closest to the window.
Got it.
And because I was sitting on the opposite side of the room,
Right.
It was the opposite hand. And, you know, there were certain things like that she, as someone who had that background, recognized as signs of dyslexia. And she had me test it. She sent me to she brought me to a professor at, I believe it was Hofstra University, who tested me for, you know, they do a variety of like intelligence tests and various kinds of testing. And at the end of it, he brings me into his office and he says to me, William, you know, I want you to know what we found. And I'm like, okay. And he's like, you're very intelligent, but you're dyslexic. And I was crying. And he was like, well, what is it? And I'm like, that I thought there was something intellectually about me that was wrong. And I think that part of that is when you're an intelligent person who wants to express things and you feel that you don't have access. I wanted to learn to read.
So I feel pretty good about this section. I feel like the two examples that you're giving, one about your family and then the other one about when you started calling yourself like, I'm William, I have dyslexia. They are both really strong examples. So I wouldn't really change anything. I'm just going to write down that this is part of this section and we can use it afterwards in the description below the first episode that we are going to launch. But overall, I think that's the most that I want to change here. Is there anything else that you have noticed or you'd like to change or emphasize in this section?
Generally speaking, I mean, I feel pretty good about it. I like that the story, the first story, and also that, you know, talking about my mother's experience. I would also agree that there are ways in which it can all be probably shortened a little bit and maybe structured a little better so that it flows for the listener, as you were saying, Maggie. Yeah, just cleaning it up.
What I want to do at the end is like having the description in terms of like text description of the episode in terms of text, like how do we describe it? So then it's always good to have the minutes. So like, let's say between minutes 8 and minutes 20, we're talking about like, and you're listing the topic so people can actually, and you can link it. So people can actually go and listen to that specific section. Or if they want to listen to it again, they don't need to like listen to the whole podcast and search for it again. So it's a trick that you can, so that's why I'm trying to like narrow it down in terms of different sections. So then we can use it. So we're moving forward, but before we continue, Denise, is there anything you'd like to add as a comment or something that you've noticed?
Very good. And I love the color of the cooking and all that comes in. So yeah, I agree. Edit it down a bit, but overall, I think it's, you know, I'm trying to also listen as if I'm just, you know, a listener. And so, yeah, I find that very engaging. The question was why did you say, I'm William May, I've got dyslexia?
For me, it was a magic badge.
A magic badge?
Yeah. Like, as I said, you know, I thought I was stupid. There was something wrong with me. And saying, no, I'm dyslexic, was it
people to know right away when they met.
Well, I was in first grade. I was proud of it because I had an experience where it was like, no, I'm not, these things that I was afraid I was as a little kid. I'm not, and it also opened up the door for me to learning to read.
Right. So the more you accepted it, the more you, sometimes
well, the moment that I found out about it, things changed in my life. Once I was diagnosed as dyslexic, I was able to get help.
Right, exactly. And also it gives you that the ability, the more you say something, the more you own it, and to a certain extent. And the more then you can then take it and make it whatever it's going to be. Do you have a piece of work, or do you think there's one piece of work that you've done that could change the trajectory of a poet's career, of your career?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, I think if we're asking more, I don't know that I can say, do I think that there is probably something that I've written that has that potential? Sure, I believe in my work. I don't know that I necessarily have the ability to predict that. There's a poet, a very well-known poet named Maggie Smith. And literally her entire career changed because of one poem she wrote.
Exactly, right.
She wrote a poem called Good Bones that it just happened that someone on a TV show liked it and they used it in a TV episode, and it, 1 million people loved that poem suddenly, and it started to trend on social media, and she became, a very well-known poet suddenly overnight. And, she can talk about how that has changed her life in both good and bad ways. So, I think that it is totally possible, but I think it's the kind of thing that it's serendipity. I've probably written a lot of poems that if certain people saw them, they would love them. But whether those people will see them and whether they will see them on the day that they're supposed to. I was talking to a group of writers last night, and somebody told this story about someone, they were at a workshop, and somebody said, you could have written the book that Joe, the agent, is waiting for. And the day that he opens your query letter, he has a headache. And
oh my God.
He only wants to read a cozy mystery because he's feeling a little bit sick.
Everything's
and
time.
He picks up your book and he says, not today, and throws it aside, and it goes into the slush pile and never to be seen again.
Right. But if he had opened it 2 days later, he might have fell in love with it.
He might have felt differently.
Maggie, our co-producer, Maggie Dimitrova, she and I were talking about that earlier today, about the fact that it's just consequences. It's a matter of, everything lining up. It's timing.
I definitely like this because it kind of goes into she didn't necessarily, have a heavy marketing team or someone that was maybe she could have, outreach to the producers of the show and suggested that they use this poem in the,
Well, I don't think, I don't think she, my impression of it from what I know is that it's not like she had access to, it was a network drama.
Okay.
On with it was a show a few years ago called Madam Secretary that was about a politics and a woman, a high-powered political position kind of thing. She recently wrote a memoir. I haven't read it yet, but so it may be that there's more to it than that.
I would definitely be interested in if it was purely by chance and someone just read it and they love it, that's a great example of how something can really, change your life, literally, of your career, because then people get interested in okay, who is that? Who is Maggie Smith? What is this book about? What?
Right.
So there is a whole world of how do you promote a book? How do you, and maybe that was not her. That's the whole thing. If that was never the goal, it's a great success. It's a great success. It's a great example.
I also feel like this is getting more towards what the podcast is intending to be about, about, so much of this so far has just been not in a bad way, but it's been about me and about my, experiences, and not necessarily about me as a writer, or is about writing in general, or about the publishing industry, or trying to get, stuff published. So, I think this is also an important sort of point in there where we can, where we're showing that we're aiming in that direction, at least.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it's completely okay for the rest of it to be more about you, because it's the first one.
Okay, so we're moving into the last section, which is about rejection, and we're also discussing the outro, so let's dive into it.
So how does rejection affect you? So obviously you're in this place now where you're looking for, I don't know if the word is acceptance versus rejection. So talk to me about rejection versus acceptance.
Rejection's hard. I'm not going to, I know writers who are very much rejection first in a certain way. They have an attitude about it that it's like, you know what, I'm going to get myself rejected as many times as I possibly can. And that's the way forward. I am not that thick-skinned.
Right.
For me, it's difficult. And, the issue becomes, how am I as a person who, I'm getting rejected by this, and trying really hard to move forward. And I believe in the work, but at a certain level, it's like, well, if nobody wants the work, how can it be good? That's a very easy question to start asking yourself, to start, having doubts.
Yeah, right. I get it. But what I understand about your work and what we've shared and you've shared with me is that you write constantly, like you're constantly writing. So rejection hasn't slowed you down any,
Well, it hasn't slowed me down in terms of producing work, but I think that there's a level at which I wonder if I would be writing different poems if I were in a better place in terms of my career. Because there is a lot of ways in which, you as a person, especially as a poet, it's very easy, it's very normal to sort of reflect yourself in the moment. It's like you're in the river of your life, and what you see is what's around you in the river.
What you're experiencing, sure. And some people say they can't write, people that are happy, they can't write the kind of love songs or the kind of stuff they want to write when they're happy. They can't, when they're too happy, they have to create the drama so that they write the kind of stuff.
Sure. I think it's very easy no matter where you are. I was just thinking about this. It's very easy no matter what things are like to be like, it would be better if it was different. And, not to realize that if it being different wouldn't necessarily be better. It would just be different. You would have other problems.
Exactly. But I was going to mention this. So let's say, how many people are in the world? Do we know? Does anybody know the exact number?
Offhand, I don't know if we've hit 1 billion yet, or I think we have. I don't know.
Probably exactly. Brilliance. But here's the thing. So how much does a book have to sell, or a poetry book or book, for it to be a bestseller? 200,000? I don't even know. But the bottom line is does it come down to finding your audience?
I think that finding an audience and finding a community of support.
Right. So maybe it shouldn't be the word rejection. Maybe it should just be finding an audience.
Okay. First of all, I don't think that finding an audience is necessarily going to stop rejection. I know poets who are well known who still get rejections on occasion.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. It's people either they like what you're doing or they don't. Either they like the cover of the book or they don't. Sometimes people will be drawn to something for a cover of the cover alone, or they heard a little piece of you on, a piece of an interview, and they look a little deeper. I think it's random. Success is random, in my opinion. And also,
I think it's very hard when you're serious about something to be like, oh, well, and now, I've done all the work and I've done all the preparation, and now it's up to everybody else to decide whether or not I get anything for it.
I get it. Yeah. Because, but to a certain extent though, isn't that, someone if someone's working so hard on a novel and they finally get it published, and then they everyone thinks it's going to be amazing, and then they release it and nothing happens. I mean, so again, it's random. And then maybe they re-release it 10 years later, it does well, who knows? And that's sort of what I think being creative is kind of about. It's constantly being in that place where you're never really sure. You do what you do, but you're not necessarily sure what's gonna hit or what people are gonna respond to. So you just do it, and you do it for yourself first. William, do you write for yourself first?
First of all, I think for me, writing is an interaction. It's about an interaction. It's not about, I can sit and think things without having to put them on a piece of paper. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I mean, the act of writing is itself a form of attempting to create something for another person. So, right. I mean, there's a level at which, like, the act of writing itself requires a faith in the existence of that other person. And,
right.
and so it has to be for them in a certain way, you know? Is there a level at which I write because of my own compulsions? Yes, of course. I mean, one, I write every day because I learned that was the only way that I was ever going to write, was that if I wrote every day, I would write every day, and then I would be writing. And I spent a long time when I was younger trying to get myself, this goes back to the learning disability, because as someone who's learning disabled, I was very successful in a structured environment when I had the impetus of other people who were going to read my work for school or whatnot, when I had deadlines, when I had outside structure. But when I got out of graduate school and I was alone, there were long periods of time when I was like, oh, I could write today. And I wouldn't, because it was like, oh, you have no deadline. You don't have any, nobody's going to read it.
Right.
And so ultimately I had to create that structure for myself. But when it comes down to thinking about the piece of writing, it's always oriented towards someone.
Question, is writing selfless? Is writing selfish? Like, who knows?
Yes and yes.
Yes and yes, exactly. Two yeses.
I mean, I don't think it's an either or. I don't think, first of all, I think it's also like, you have to talk about an individual act of writing. It's like, we can talk about any kind of activity, and I can give you an example of the person doing it who's being selfish, and I can give you an example of a person doing it. You could steal a loaf of bread because you're trying to make the baker angry that you stole his loaf of bread. You could steal the loaf of bread because your daughter's, child is dying, like Jean Valjean. You know what I mean? Like, right. Those are the same act, but they are very different.
Exactly. I was thinking too, for some reason I thought of like a pitcher at baseball. Like, is he playing baseball for himself, or is he playing baseball for the fans? And I guess that's partially what being an artist is about.
I think that anytime you become a professional at anything, there's a level at which you have to accept that you're no longer just doing it for yourself.
Right.
Because that's what being a professional is.
Right. That's true.
You have to
and
perform,
I think with the ending of the professional and the yes, selfish, selfless, I think this is a good place to pause for the moment until the next one.
Okay.
Cool.
Sounds good.
Okay, so that's it. That was the last.
Right. And I think obviously we're going to need something at the end here, not just the call to action stuff, something to frame it again.
I would say maybe before we play the thing about the website, maybe your voice into like maybe thinking like, thank you for listening.
I mean, I think also like a little bit of a conclusion, a wrap up.
Conclusion, yeah, maybe a conclusion. Okay, so that concludes like this episode.
Yeah.
If you want to stay in touch, like one thing that I would say, because of your monthly newsletter, maybe like if you want to stay in touch with me, I
think the call to action stuff is going to be like, because of the fact that it's kind of an odd episode with Denise interviewing me.
Yeah.
that I think it's important to sort of move out of that again before we close the episode. I'm going to go and write some stuff that I can then, record to go around it, as it were,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cool.
So I think we're good. This is William May saying goodbye. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with your friends. If not, please share it with your enemies.
ARGH, Not Another Podcast About Book Publishing, is produced by Denise Marsa, Maggie Dimitrova, and William May. Please visit williammaywrites.com for social media links, recited poems, and more.